You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, available online at TalkDigitalNetwork.com. Welcome to HowStreet.com radio, the online source for market opinions. Here is Jim Goddard.
My guest is David Smith. He's the senior analyst for the Morgan Report, which you can find online at silver-investor.com. Welcome to the show, Dave.
It's good to be back, Jim. How are you doing today?
Well, I'm doing terrifically well. Today, we're going to be chatting about, do you really understand all these terms that we throw around so often? I'm not a financial expert, so frankly, I don't use these terms very often. But do you understand? And you said, really, when it comes to investing, understand the language of the trade, which keeps evolving, by the way. We were joking previously. I know the Pentagon, for example, an optically guided kinetic connecting device, $900. You can go down to your home hardware store and buy the same thing for $9. It's a hammer. So
it's really amazing. And, you know, in the field of investment, these things, as you mentioned, our whole language evolves over time. We have words like Google that start out with as a noun and end up as a verb. But a lot of times we have terms that either they become socially suspect or they have a bad connotation or whatever. And so the entities come up with something that sounds a little more innocuous, and usually it's even more obscure. And when I think of these words and how they change, especially in the investment arena, which we're kind of focused on here, I think of the Alice in Wonderland where the Cheshire Cat is talking to Alice, and he says, a word means exactly what I say it means, nothing more and nothing less. And so I think that's kind of where we are with some of these things. When in the markets, when the choices are made by people that we don't like, it's called correcting market failure. And when you have people that sell, for example, junk mortgages, which happened, almost brought down the housing industry permanently in the United States a few years ago, and they know these things are just really garbage and they sell them to push them out the door, even having what they call robo-signing, where they would have machines to sign these mortgages, or individuals that would go through a stack without even interviewing anybody. And this is now called mis-selling, M-I-S-selling. And so they also, it tends to make it more innocuous, and you almost wonder if maybe it's legal or maybe it's ethical. And so these things, they're kind of humorous in a way unless you happen to be on the sharp end of one of these issues. The new term now for in the resource sector, when a country wants to increase the price that they charge the price that they charge a producer, it's now called a social rent. And this might be a company that is manned by people that are actually live in the country and are residents of that country, let alone someone that is coming in and producing something. And so in South Africa now, this has become a pretty interesting deal. They call it resource rental tax, and they're going to levy a 50% windfall levy on certain producers of the platinum group metals and gold companies, you know, which are already struggling to just become profitable. And so it's almost like the government has its antenna out, and if they can find out anywhere where there's a profit being made, well, we just can't have that. So we need to take that as much as possible for the good of the locals. And sometimes that's honorable, but a lot of times it's really not, because it oftentimes ends up in the pockets of those who are doing the taking rather than having a trickle-down effect to the people that really probably could use it.
Yeah, and how do you rent a resource anyway? I mean, once I take the iron ore out of the ground, I don't think it's going to be anything else but steel. How do I rent that?
Well, it actually is, it's pretty strange. And, you know, some things are more blatant, like in Argentina now, which is having all sorts of social and political issues. They have just, they put up, they don't even bother with euphemisms. They just come up with a new regulation that you can only take so much money out of the country at a time, or if you bring it in, you have to tell as a company what you're going to use it for the next 90 days and things like that. It's just like putting more and more sand in the gears of a machine. And of course, the problem of putting sand in the gears of a machine is that it wears out the machine, and eventually it comes to the point where the gears don't work. They either get worn away, the teeth get worn away, or it just comes to a complete stop. And it's amazing to me how often in history the government hasn't figured this out. You know, they keep tweaking it to the point where it doesn't work anymore, and they kill the host. So it's pretty depressing for people that are actually trying to make a legitimate profit.
Yeah, and I know in Europe now they're going to restrict. There's already a restriction in how much cash you can take out in euros, and they're cutting that down by another half. So I think the most you can take out now is about $650, and for a lot of that's what you go grocery shopping with, and if you need shoes for the kids. You could easily see how $650 would disappear in a second. But
we'll see more and more of that, too, I'll guarantee you. And in Argentina, for example, and I was reading a few weeks ago of a family that wanted to come and have a 2-week vacation in Florida, and I think there were 6 members of the family. Well, they applied for being able to take out the money. They were allowed to take out, not per person, but for the family, $150. Well, that's just ridiculous. And then if they were to use their charge card, say in Florida, in Miami, they have to pay a 15 or 20% surcharge to use that because they're involved in U.S. dollars. And, of course, this is just totally ridiculous, and it is self-defeating. And I don't know how anybody that just puts these regulations out can feel that it can take you to a better place, but that's what you're looking at. Another thing that I ran into, I kind of keep a list of some of these things. Some of them are pretty humorous and some of them aren't. But, we used to hear about monetary easing. Well, that's pretty obvious. Anybody on the street can figure out, well, the government's going to print some more money so that there's more money in circulation. And then it became quantitative easing, which is a little more highfalutin sounding. QE, we call it for short. And the newest now is liquidity enhancement. Well, that sounds pretty not like a problem. It doesn't sound like it could cause any issues, but we do know that that sort of thing, when velocity picks up, when money starts turning over more quickly, and people start putting it into riskier assets, that leads to inflation. And if it's not taken care of, it leads to hyperinflation, where the money becomes worth less and less and less until it finally becomes worthless.
Yeah, and the classic case of that was Germany prior to World War II.
Definitely.
Their economy was devastated by the First World War and the reparation payments they had to make to all the Allied nations for the war damage. They had nothing to run their economy, and literally you would have 3 billion marks, enough to fill a wheelbarrow, and you couldn't buy a loaf of bread with it.
And there's also a circumstance in China which fewer people are aware of, but had just as devastating impacts as you mentioned, was the great Chinese hyperinflation between 1945 and 1949. At the end of World War II, when shortly thereafter the communists under Mao Zedong took over, they had this inflation of the money supply, and it just went through the roof to the point that the currency itself was completely worthless. So these things recur from time to time. We've seen it more recently in Zimbabwe, and we've seen it on a smaller scale, but yet still not played out in Venezuela, where they made about a 40% overnight haircut to people's purchasing power. The next morning, the people ran out to try to buy whatever was on the shelf before it was taken off, because they could, basically the old prices were still there. And they bought extra things. They don't need 3 refrigerators, but they can use that as a barter, anything that can be used, because that shows that the money is not trusted anymore. And that's the important thing that governments have to be careful of. If the people lose trust in the money, the paper money, then it's all over. And that's why you see the suppression efforts of gold and silver, and people are waking up to this, that their money is worth less and less, and the only thing that holds its value over time and that is completely fungible are the precious metals. And so that's why the bull market continues. And this is a topic that you and I have visited many times. In fact, it's one of our central discussions, over the months that we've been doing the show. Here's another term that I like, and this one, to me, it's fascinating and kind of interesting, and it's very much informative when you learn the definition. It's called regulatory capture, and I would posit that this is one of the primary things that's going on in the United States today in regards to government agencies and the industries that they regulate. And so what you have here with regulatory capture is you have an industry or a sector that's under government oversight that somehow captures the overseers themselves. And they do this by having a back and forth motion where somebody who's a regulator later goes to work for the company, or vice versa, or through contributions, political contributions. It's like water seeking its own level, and often it's a low level. And of course, the people that lose out on this are the public, the people that are supposed to be being watched over, these agencies watching over the industry in the public's interest. And so that a lot of times that becomes an afterthought if it's even considered at all. But I think regulatory capture is a tremendously descriptive term that really describes what actually takes place.
Yeah, and we were talking about how other things have been affected like this. Nowadays you cannot find a used car. It's pre-owned or pre-driven, pre-something. But, they certainly don't want to give you the impression that it isn't good anymore.
Well, think of the cars that are out there on the market now from Sandy, from Hurricane Sandy. These things have been flooded, and you can imagine how that works. I mean, those things are never going to be restored properly. And I remember a number of years ago when we had the big eruption, Mount St. Helens, and it buried many of these cars, completely full of ash and stuff like this, and a lot of them were cleaned out. Well, imagine buying a car that's all spiffy and waxed up, but what you didn't know was that it was 10 miles from Mount St. Helens, and they end up with 20 pounds of volcanic ash inside the motor mounts, the motor housing. So that's the sort of thing that can happen. Here's another one that this is, we have increasing regulatory climate and increasing oversight of government by the government of individuals and in our country and really Canada and elsewhere. This is called suspicionless seizure. This is the term that the Department of Homeland Security uses, that they can take your laptop or your cell phone up to 100 or 150 miles inside the U.S. border. They don't need any probable cause. They just maybe want to just check around and see what's going on. And they can, under suspicionless seizure, they don't need any suspicion at all, as the term implies, to take your phone or your laptop, and they can hold it for up to 120 days.
Wow.
So this is kind of talk about a slippery slope, but it's just it's really interesting, and it's a little spooky too sometimes.
Well, the laws that are governing our very modern society, they're using laws that were made in the 20s and 30s when the telephone was still a relatively new invention. Radio had just been invented and TV didn't exist. Now I can get radio and TV on my telephone. So,
well, you're exactly correct, Jim. And it isn't just the terminology that hasn't kept up with it, and even the way to regulate and how government should be involved without destroying individual rights and privacy. But it's the legal system. The legality hasn't been determined on a lot of these things, and it won't be until a major court case comes up to a federal court. It often starts out at a local court, and then if it has enough legs, it can go all the way to the Supreme Court. But that's how you end up with the codification of laws which deal with these things. But the technology is moving so quickly, and the ways in which we utilize it, that the laws are hopelessly behind, and it really makes it a quandary for everybody involved, even for well-meaning government agencies, which I assume there are some out there. I thought just for fun we might want to close here from one. This is from the private sector, because we don't want to just pick on the public sector, but this is, I think, pretty humorous, and people can make up their own minds as to how they want to approach this. But this is the terminology called restructured meat technology. And so there's a couple different companies that have been involved with this product, and we don't need to mention who they are. In fact, my guess is that probably a lot of different companies involved with it. But just for fun, I looked it up to see what that meant, because restructured meat technology, that could mean a lot of things. Well, here's what it means, and I'll just read this. I think it's worth our time to hear it. Restructured meat products are commonly manufactured by using lower valued meat trimmings, reduced in size by comminution. I think I'm pronouncing that right. It's spelled comminution, and that word is defined as flaking, chunking, grinding, chopping, or slicing. The comminuted meat mixture is mixed with salt and water to extract salt-soluble proteins. These extracted proteins are critical to produce a glue, quote-unquote, which binds muscle pieces together. These muscle pieces may be then reformed to produce a meat log, quote-unquote, of specific form or shape. The log is then cut into steaks or chops, which when cooked are similar in appearance and texture to their intact muscle counterparts. Such products as tripe, heart, scalded stomachs are high in protein, completely edible, wholesome, and nutritious, and most are already in use in sausage without objection. End quote. So here we have this stuff. You may think you're looking at a T-bone steak, or a rib of some kind, or some particular meat product like that, but you are actually looking at reconstituted meat products. So quite a bit different story than what might appear on the surface.
Well, I know McDonald's admitted they use pork to make their McRib sandwich, but not any rib meat actually goes into it. So it's every
amazing.
other part of
It's all about definitions, and I think in terms of those of us who want to really know what we're putting in our stomach, it's good to find out where these things came from. I remember in Canada, this is a couple of years ago, I was up in the Kelowna area going to do a presentation, and it's well inland, and I saw on the menu they had sustainable salmon. And so immediately, I get a little bit naive, but I thought, sustainable salmon, now that's another word for wild salmon, because by definition, right? And so I almost ordered it. I thought I would ask, so how do you define sustainable salmon? Sustainable salmon was defined by them as farm salmon, which are produced in a pond well inland. So these fish were kind of like a variation of the Atlantic salmon that we think of as the farm fish.
Well, they are Atlantic salmon. Because the Chinook and the other West Coast salmon don't survive in tanks.
Well, if you see Atlantic salmon, you always know it's farm salmon on the menu. But I was kind of hoodwinked on this because I immediately, taken the benefit of the doubt. Well, if it's sustainable, it's probably wild. So it really is interesting and fascinating, and it takes a little homework to do your questions in a restaurant, but it can really pay off if you want to try to eat the highest quality product, because frankly for me, my choice is that I only want wild salmon. I don't want sustainable salmon or farm salmon or anything else, and that's what I prefer. And so I do the same thing with the meat, the beef that I eat, to find out where that might come from, and even the prawns. I assumed that most of these big tiger prawns I like to eat were from the ocean too, and I found out that the majority of them are produced in farms in places like Thailand. And, so I just prefer to eat the wild ones and find out if that's the case. And if not, well, I'll be happy to have a vegetable salad.
Which might be made from restructured meat technology.
Well, hopefully not, but I guess
you have
flip a coin.
Yes, well, maybe it's restructured vegetable technology. It looks like a piece of celery, but it's not. It's something else. So
but I think in terms of our investment decisions, knowing what words and phrases mean, it's all to the good, and it takes a little extra effort. But I think for the complete investor, so to speak, it's a person that's willing to do that little extra legwork, and it can put extra dollars in their pocket.
And if you're talking to an advisor and they throw out one of those cute little terms, ask them what does that mean? I've never heard that before.
Exactly.
And you always hear there's no such thing as a stupid question, and we all know that there is. But on the other hand, it's my money. I deserve to get...
Exactly right.
Yeah.
Nobody cares as much about your money, Jim, as you do. It's the same thing when you go in to see the doctor. And if you don't care about your money, other people will be more than happy to take it from you.
And maybe make some restructured meat technology products.
Very possibly.
With that. Well, David, very interesting subject. Know what you're talking about, folks. And if you hear words that you don't understand or sound totally new, or a phrase that you haven't heard before, it's probably covering up something you know all about. They're just calling insider trading now, non-material adjusted, non-public information. Stuff like that. It's still insider trading. It's still a bad idea. And, just make sure that what they're telling you, you understand. So when you invest your money, it's going to the right place for the right reason. And I guess, the ultimate example of how, we use words to cover up what really happened was the term the Pentagon came up with, collateral damage. And we all know what that means now. So let's hope there isn't any collateral damage to your investment account. My guest has been David Smith. He's the senior analyst for the Morgan Report, which you can find online at silver-investor.com. You're listening to HowStreet.com radio, and you can contact us at info@HowStreet.com. I'm Jim Goddard.